Just a quick disclaimer, this video has minor spoilers for JoJo, nothing major or show ruining, but just in case you want to go into the series completely blind, come back later. Also, some of the sources used have homophobic and ableist language, so beware of that. I wonder how quickly this video would get taken down if I called Jojo Gay a fat. As much as this is a video about JoJo, this is also a video about subtext and how it affects or doesn't affect the media which we consume. In order to answer the question of why some people think JoJo is gay, we need to talk about subtext. Explaining what subtext is isn't always easy because no one can seem to agree on a definition, but if we have a look at a few, you should be able to get an idea. Subtext is the implicit or metaphorical meaning. Subtext is a hidden or less obvious meaning. And for a longer explanation, subtext is any content of a creative work which is not announced explicitly by characters or the author but is implicit or becomes understood by the audience. The definition I'll be working with for this video is subtext being what goes unsaid. It is not canon, it is not objective, and it does not even have to be intentional. Subtext is something a person or a group of people notice when interacting with and consuming any media. I know it sounds vague, but it will become more obvious when explored as examples. While everyone picks up on different things and has a unique experience with the media they consume, it gets interesting when groups of people start to realize they're having a similar response to the same media, and picking up on similar aspects of that media which are not explicit. It's almost like some media has a telepathic connection to some people, but in a more guttural rather than fantastical way. I mentioned in my personal definition that subtext doesn't always have to be intentional, but that isn't always the case. Many extended definitions of subtext will remind you that subtext has often been used as a tool by creators to bypass censors and reference taboo topics without having to explicitly mention them. While this is less needed nowadays from a Western perspective, censorship is still practiced in plenty of countries to varying degrees of severity, and even still in Western media there is a certain level of soft censorship where certain topics will be avoided and treated like they don't exist for a variety of reasons. A different way I like to explain subtext to make it more tactile is to compare it to theory videos or predictions. Subtext is similar to these by people picking up on clues, hints and details which may or may have not been intended by the creators, and letting this become a significant part of how they enjoy the media. This isn't a perfect comparison, with subtext often being more thematic, but I think it helps paint a picture. While I think you can approach all media from a subtextual perspective, I think there is some media which is more appropriate to read subtextually than others. While media relies on varying levels of interpretation, with some media seeming pretty face value, there will always be something which has been left unsaid, some context which is worth considering, or a certain theme which just resonates. Just like how some media is more fitting to be read subtextually, there are some people who are more likely to read media subtextually. If reading subtextually is something you think you don't do, I hope this video will be able to give you an insight into people who do, and even use this to inform you if you want to start reading media subtextually. When it comes to people who are more likely to read media subtextually, there are obvious examples like critics or academics, but there are also some groups who this comes to more naturally. I promise I'll get back to JoJo. Just a quick disclaimer, I'm using the words gay and queer quite interchangeably, and I'm choosing the one which fits the context best when they're used. I know there's a massive debate around this, and this unfortunately isn't the video for that, but I hope you will understand when I use them and why I use them. So, if your media, for example, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, is being called gay or something similar, but there's little to no explicit representation present, why is this being done? Queer subtext. Queer subtext, luckily, is much easier to define than subtext as a whole. There is still some healthy debate around its exact definition, but I'm more comfortable explaining it more concretely. If you're watching media with a queer subtextual approach, you're watching it from the perspective of a queer person. This means taking into account common shared experiences, as well as particular themes and character traits which might resonate with this audience. So while queer subtext does encapsulate labeling certain media as gay or queer, it also encapsulates much more than this. For example, queer coding, queer baiting, or even identifying the opposite when media seems anti-queer. Because of these traits of queer subtext, it of course comes more naturally to a queer consumer, but this is not exclusive. You just have to be well versed enough on the queer experience to be able to view media using this lens. It just understandably may not feel as natural. Experiencing media with a queer subtextual approach is also not seeing the characters as straight until proven guilty. There is a presupposition in mainstream media analysis or interpretation that unless a fictional character is explicitly shown to be queer, they are straight. Queer readings ignore this expectation and take into account how frustrating it can be for queer audiences to hear that all characters are straight by default. When it comes to discussing subtext, there is also an entrenched expectation that queer subtext will come up in conversation. This is because of the aforementioned aim of subtext being intentionally used to get around censors. One of the most common uses of subtext was to portray queer characters and stories where this legally wouldn't have been possible. This is why picking up on queer subtext comes so naturally to a lot of people. Queer people have historically, and even still, had to pick up on clues and subtle theming to get representation, instead of getting it in the text itself. Barton explains,
"Looking beyond text and instead delving into the subtext allows LGBTQ+ people the freedom of reinterpretation, and was, until very recently, the only form of representation we were allowed."
But this has, as many things do, led to controversy, since queer subtext is, by nature, not explicit. Some audiences have picked up on it where it may have not been intended by the author. This becomes even more abstract when considering media which has many hands responsible for its creation, for example films, television, or even video games. So is queer subtext even a valid way of experiencing media if there is no way to confirm whether or not it was intended? There is an ongoing conflict between those who seek representation in the media they consume and the people who deny its existence. Are you picking up on theming and character choices to get the representation you are looking for? Or are you looking in too deep and deluding yourself into thinking something is there which is not? When looking at queer subtext, I do think it's important to remember that this form of interpretation is seen as subversive and goes outside of convention when it comes to traditional methods of interpreting media. This is explained more eloquently by Doty, stating,
"Since the consumption, uses, and discussion of mass culture as queer still find us moving between being on the inside and the outside of straight culture's critical language, representational codes, and market practices, we are in a position to refuse, confuse, and redefine the terms by which mass culture is understood by the public."
This concept of understanding the more abstract ways people interact with media is integral to this discussion. With the omnipresence of social media communication and discussion of media being as mainstream as it's ever been, we can see that not everyone experiences media in the same way. These differences in experience are worth exploring. We can see the bad reputation queer subtext has amassed in a form which is more commonly recognized in modern shipping culture. This has led to disagreements surrounding characters' sexuality becoming massively volatile. We are seeing a growing presence of people not understanding or even refusing to understand the different ways people interpret media. Instead of mutual understanding and respecting individual interpretations, disagreements usually lead to intense animosity. This has led to certain media having fan bases that feel more like collections of warring factions instead of people who enjoy the same media. So, what kind of media has factions large enough on each side to warrant an analysis worth talking about? If you don't know, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, or just JoJo, is a manga series by Hirohiko Araki which has been ongoing since 1987. It received a brief and largely unsuccessful OVA adaptation in the mid-90s, but when it comes to discussions about the JoJo anime, people will be referring to the seasons which have been releasing since 2012. JoJo is an intergenerational narrative following members of the Joestar family tree and their misadventures in the different eras and countries they are local to, whether this is 19th century England, 90s Japan, or even Florida. This has allowed the narrative to remain fresh throughout its extended run. While JoJo's Bizarre Adventure does have a loose overarching story, these arcs, or parts as they're more widely referred to, with 8 completed and a 9th on the way, act as their own mostly self-contained stories and could be easily enjoyed standalone. The series can be characterized by its many unique traits, but Araki's distinct evolving aesthetic and refreshing approach to action in a shonen series is a large contributor to what helps this series stay relevant. While Araki's series has always had a certain level of popularity to necessitate the series lasting so long, the worldwide popularity of the series grew quickly following the 2012 adaptation of the first 2 parts. This just kept growing with the 2014 adaptation of the 3rd part, the 2016 adaptation of Part 4, the 2018 adaptation of Part 5, and the still ongoing 6th part since 2021. Not that Netflix wants you to know about it. Because of this, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure has one of the largest and most consistently active and growing fanbases of any anime in the last decade, and with a fanbase so big, debate is of course a constant. Also, it's worth stating now that the main focus of this video will be on the first 5 parts of JoJo, because these happen to be the seasons with the most relevant discussion, as well as the seasons I have watched and feel qualified to talk about. I know as part 6 has plenty of relevant material, I'm just waiting for it to eventually finish before I watch it. An interesting thing to note about JoJo in the past decade is that while the anime adaptation has been releasing quite consistently throughout the decade, Part 8's manga was released relatively slowly and only recently finishing its run a decade after it began. This means that the fanbase of JoJo has largely been discussing and debating old material since its mainstream inception, with of course a decent amount of discussion on the new manga content, but also a high concentration of discussion on decades-old content, which for any other shonen series would be old news. Because of this, especially for the parts which have been animated, there is a high level of disagreement over fan opinions. Not to blame the author, but Araki's writing style certainly doesn't discourage this level of engagement. Due to the part structure JoJo uses, there is absolutely no excess content, at least for the first 5 parts. Every scene serves to progress the overarching narrative. We are given relevant and necessary character details and plot points, and then we use this to move on to the next character detail or plot point. Even in part 4, which seems to be more slice of life, no episode is filler and everything has an eventual narrative payoff. While this means the series has great pacing, it also means that a lot is left to audience imagination, especially when it comes to character details. Because we only see characters in important moments, there are a lot of details we are free to fill in ourselves based on what we have been shown about the character. While this serves to help some people engage with the media more and have a more interactive experience, it of course leads to differing perspectives on characters, with some people seeing them in completely different ways. This is especially prevalent in later JoJo arcs, which have larger ensemble casts where we get less time with each character, so more of their personalities can be projected onto by the audience. So more so than many other authors who tend to have a more authoritative view of their characters, Araki has left the floodgates open for many details of his characters to be up for interpretation, and as expected, this has led to a certain sect of JoJo fans seeing this as an opportunity to pick up on the queer subtext potentially present and run with it. It is worth noting that Araki has also done little to discourage these queer readings, but more on that later. So, to answer the original question, what are people saying when they say JoJo is gay? Just a bit of a forewarning, when people are discussing JoJo and it being gay, there is a big focus on male homosexuality, and because of this is mostly what I discuss. There will be some discussion of other forms of queerness, especially gender nonconformity and non-cisgender identities, but for the most part there will be a disproportionate focus on male homosexuality. I'm going to reference some other readings of JoJo later on, but in the interest of answering this essay's question, Araki's work definitely lends itself to a queer reading. While all parts of JoJo have their share of queer readings, the parts following part 2 especially get more due to little focus being placed on in-text character relationships, therefore leaving the door open for character interpretation. Before going too in-depth on the actual reasons people see JoJo as gay, I want to go over a misconception on why JoJo fans assume people see JoJo as gay. I am sure there is a better way to put this, but the more honest description is the sus moments in JoJo. Something you hear quite often, and I have seen when people recommend JoJo, is that when people accuse JoJo of being gay, a lot of fans will jump in and say something along the lines of, "Oh, people just think that because of the sus jokes," but those are just jokes and don't mean anything. The jokes they're referring to are 2 gags in Part 3 and Part 5 respectively. In Part 3 we see Joseph and Avdol manipulated by an enemy's magnetic powers to thrust up against each other in public, and in Part 5, Giorno is healing Mister, which is seen from a certain angle by Narancia to look like the pair are having a much more intimate moment with each other. These are both jokes made by Araki about his characters being subject to embarrassing misunderstandings. Since a clear theme of these jokes is homosexuality, a lot of JoJo fans who do not have clear readings of the series assume this is why other people do. But with just a little research, you can see that no one accredits these 2 jokes to having anything to do with a queer reading or a gay interpretation. So, if this is not why, then what is? From what I have gathered, a general explanation for why JoJo has been labelled as some by gay is the overall queer tone of the series, which can be recognised in every facet of the show. The aesthetic, the character choices, the world building, the references, even the combat. It would be easy to keep making these vague statements, but a better way to give you an idea of what queer readings are based on is to give some examples of people who have experienced the media this way. It is worth mentioning that not all of these align with my own interpretation of the media. However, these are accurate examples of how some people have a queer reading of JoJo. In an essay on queer representation in anime, the anonymous author uses JoJo as an example for why anime is so popular with queer audiences, in spite of lacking much explicit queer representation.
Take the famous example of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. The clothing and hairstyles of the character challenge men's fashion. All of them can walk on in the Emmy-winning series RuPaul's Drag Race and not look out of place. It is the rejection of realism, however, that gives anime character. The anime fantasy is imaginative and dynamic. It is a place where one can simply disregard the confines of the real world and experiment with self-expression and relationships.
This example comments on how Araki's work is an example of the anime fantasy, which is part of why queer people as a whole are so connected to anime. While this reference to JoJo fashion is appreciated, let's look at something more specific. Ruben Ferdinand wrote an analysis of JoJo and its relation to queer masculinity, and they go into great detail on this. For a start, their explanation of JoJo's queer masculinity is phrased clearly with them saying,
I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the men of JoJo carry masculinity in non-conforming ways. They defy the cis-heterosexual prisons of how masks are taught to approach body language, fashion style, and presentation. Instead, characters dress freely, move dramatically, and pose sensually. To me, a queer man, it feels like an incredibly queer show in a way I haven't seen anywhere else.
This direct connection to themselves as a queer man and how the series connects to their experience is a perfect example of a queer reading using queer subtext. Like our previous source from the anonymous author, Ferdinand also uses Araki's use of fashion to further corroborate their points, saying,
The men have amazing hair and wear revealing clothes. Their materials, accessories, colours, and patterns suggest that a vibrant fetish culture has merged with mainstream fashion, that open sexuality has won over shame. Shame on this axis seems to be eradicated entirely. There is literally no instance in the 30-plus years of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure where a character makes a remark about another character's style choices, not as a quip or a gag, not even when schoolboys Josuke and Okayasu adjust their school uniforms to their own personal preferences.
While this is on the face a point about Araki's use of fashion, I see this extract as Ferdinand exposing how Araki has created a world more accepting of queer identities, and not bound by sexual shame, which can be identified through how the characters in this series interact with fashion. Ferdinand continues this point with further evidence on their reading, saying,
Araki designates clothes as componential and essential with regards to character identity, something that inexorably exists without objection. This reads as a natural exception for gender exploration and sexual diversity, geared specifically towards queer masculinities. The men dress so bodily and inescapably unique simply because JoJo's reconfiguration of public space permits them to. There are no hegemonic, institutional, or industrial powers that say they can't wear like a shirt filled with holes or a necktie looped underneath.
This further explanation of Araki's queer utopia is doubled down upon in their conclusion, where Ferdinand makes a conclusive statement on their view of Araki's version of masculinity.
It's clear that JoJo's argument for queer masculinity resides in the permission of masked body types to partake in typically feminine, sometimes even misogynistic, tropes of choreography, posture, and drama. What it results in is a manliness that is safe, sexual, and queer.
Ferdinand's use of the phrase misogynist to describe the type of femininity the JoJo men sometimes embody encapsulates the subversive nature of queer readings of media. Ferdinand's essay on JoJo's queer masculinity is complex and written in an obviously academic way, which I appreciate, but in doing so maybe ends up being a bit too foggy for a specific queer viewing of JoJo from a more grounded perspective. This is not me calling Vanessa Mackey's interpretation of JoJo grounded, but their clear walkthrough of their obviously queer perspective on JoJo makes her perspective seem simple to follow. Their straightforward explanation of Part 4 and 5 is a great example of a queer reading of a specific series of events, with them describing,
Diamond is Unbreakable and Golden Wind feature the queerest characters and atmosphere. The main characters are assumed queer, the villains are together in visible relationships, and queer masculinity is in complete motion. These chapters of the series feature men with highly fashionable and androgynous clothings, mannerisms that aren't heterosexual, and even life energy strands that aren't always masculine. Diamond is Unbreakable's main antagonist, Kira Yoshikage, is a manifestation of a toxic cis man's ownership issues, outsmarted by the queer-coded central protagonist, Josuke. Golden Wind has a plethora of both queer-coded and explicitly queer characters. Its main and complex antagonist, Diavolo, looks incredibly androgynous in his mesh-wiring top that doesn't leave much to the imagination, tight purple pants, long pink hair, and makeup. Diavolo is complex, the same person as Vinegar Doppio. Though Doppio came first, both physical forms are androgynous. Central protagonist Giorno Giovanna is notable as the biological son of both Dio and Jonathan, due to Gio attaching his head to Jonathan's body.
While this series of statements may not be everyone's first reading of JoJo, upon critical thinking you can understand how Maki got to all of these conclusions. The issue with a single commenter on the article had was with a perhaps hyperbolic statement of the main characters are assumed queer, which is understandable. However, I see this as Maki saying in the world of Part 4 and 5 especially, there is no hegemonic unrealistic societal expectation for the characters present to not be queer. The few examples we do see of heterosexual attraction we see also tend to be demonized. For some quick examples in part 4, Josuke is a child of a heterosexual affair, Yukako's attraction to Koichi is initially incredibly violent, and the main villain of the part, Kira, is also shown to have a violent attraction towards women, as well as assimilating into a dysfunctional heterosexual family unit, in comparison to the hero's family being a single mother and a single grandfather. For part 5 there is less, but Giorno's troubled relationship with his mother sticks out, with her romantic relationships killing her relationship with her son. For some more quickfire queer readings of JoJo, Francesca Tachi's essay is all about how the gender expression presented in Araki's work is a perfect representation of non-binary euphoria, with them summarizing this stating,
"If gender euphoria for non-binary people had a tangible shape, it would be that of Araki's work."
Mary Lee Sorda released a duology of articles going through every part and evaluating the potential queerness of the characters, with a highlight being their interpretation of Kakyoin from part 3, saying,
Dio's powerful charisma works especially well on the only other character with significant gay implications, Kakyoin. Kakyoin was born with this strand, but felt isolated from his peers because none of them could see this unique part of him. But when Dio appeared before him, surrounded by roses and hovering close to his ears, Kakyoin was easily taken in. This doesn't necessarily mean that Kakyoin is a closeted homosexual, but his backstory certainly follows a similar narrative.
Another highlight of Sorda's article is their subtextual reading of Josuke's queerness, openly referencing subtext, saying the subtext comes less from his relationships with other characters and more from his personality. Finally, Max Jenikov references Araki's use of queer art references.
In the world of JJBA fan art, this has largely manifested as an astonishing amount of beefcake portraiture, styles ranging from fashion plate to Michelangelo to Tom of Finland. The original stories themselves dwell on sensual poses and homosocial devotion between men, so it is less surprising and more in the spirit of JoJoverse. Why is Dio drawn naked on the cover of a compilation volume? Hirohiko Araki says he wanted to show off his beautiful body. JJBA is full of subtext and suggestive content, just waiting for someone to elaborate on what goes on behind closed doors.
Subtext and suggestive content someone should elaborate on? What an interesting concept. Jenikov's combination of Michelangelo and Tom of Finland here feels like an astoundingly apt way of describing the tone of Araki's artwork, which I'm surprised no one has picked up on before. On top of these critical examples of JoJo's queer tone, I think it's worth mentioning some other examples which I have no specific critical references for. There is a general understanding in Sex of the Fandom that part 1 and 2 especially take heavy reference from the overtly masculine and homoerotic buff men action movies of the 80s. As well as this, there are also the similarities between JoJo posing, which has become synonymous with the franchise, and the dance style of voguing, synonymous with the African-American queer ballroom scene where it originated. It's worth noting that nowhere in these genuine queer readings is anyone citing Joseph and Avdol's humping or Giorno and Mister's mistaken fellatio as a reason for JoJo being gay. While there are some common elements between these readings, you can see how answering why people see JoJo as gay is not something you can accurately answer in a couple of sentences, but what you can see is that a common occurrence with queer JoJo fans is a tendency to see inherent queerness in this series at a more than skin-deep level. Common comeback to all of these readings is often something along the lines of this not being Araki's intention, and while I'm going to go more in-depth on authorial intent later on, I just want to address this rebuttal in case it seems like I'm avoiding it. It's easy to say this was not Araki's intention. Araki did not publish a mission statement alongside writing JoJo, and nowhere does Araki discourage fan interpretation of his media. Also, unlike some other mangaka, Araki has never talked down to his queer audience or openly complained about their presence, but more on this later. So as previously mentioned, Araki's open-ended writing style makes having unique readings of his characters easy, but not everyone has the same reading. In fact, many people have directly countering interpretations, especially with something as divisive as a queer reading. So how do these disagreements tend to manifest? So, JoJo is a shonen series. To some it's seinen, but close enough. And like a lot of shonen series, it has a very large and passionate following. And like any large following, there are plenty of chances for there to be a division over certain issues. If you do not know, shonen is a term to describe manga and anime which is aimed towards boys, with seinen being for men. And for most part, these are action and adventure series. I am not here to make any sweeping statements about people who enjoy shonen series, but I think it's fair to say that a large portion of shonen fans do not approach this media from a subtextual perspective. While this is by no means all shonen fans, like the JoJo fans from the last section, it is a significant and vocal part of the following. These fans tend to have an obsession with canon and because of this do not approach media from an interpretive perspective. Usually this would not be an issue, after all, people can enjoy media however they want. But because these fans are often so set on their canonical view of media, they often respond negatively and aggressively to a subtextual reading. This is not exclusive to JoJo, but it is especially prevalent within this fandom, and it also gets quite toxic quite easily. I'm going to get into some examples of this soon, but before this I want to provide a potential explanation why, and then you can see if you can recognize it in the examples I'm going to show. I think that a lot of the fans who vehemently deny queer readings of JoJo are subconsciously aware of the undeniable queer elements and influences of the series, and because this is a big part of what makes JoJo unique, it is at least partially a contributing factor to their enjoyment. And because they are aware of peers who are not fans labeling JoJo as gay in a more derogatory sense, denying JoJo's queerness becomes personal, as it is a way of defending themselves from being associated with something which could be called gay. Now, where did I go to find these arguments? Of course, the only place they get interesting enough, forums. I think the best way to display these opinions is by starting with some pretty tame comments and then working our way up from toxic to more toxic. Starting with a My Anime List thread titled "Why I Hate That JoJo Is Gay," we see our OP start to complain about JoJo's association as a gay series, since it does not feature many gay characters in comparison to other series with more explicit representation like Attack on Titan, Berserk, and One Piece. They continue saying,
Why the hate just for JoJo? Is it because it has a different art style? Everyone says JoJo is gay, when in reality, out of 8 parts, only part 5 had a gay couple. People call the Avdol and Joseph comedy moment gay, like that type of humour doesn't exist in like 1,000 films. If it's a comedy moment from JoJo, then it's gay, but if it's Naruto Sasuke kissing, then it's funny. If it's from Gintama, it's hilarious. In one episode, Kondo and Shogun from Gintama were in a dog star position. Everyone finds that really funny, but when it's Jirono and Misa, it's gay.
This prompts a few responses from different users giving their explanation for why this is.
It's just a meme playing off how hyper-masculine so many of the characters are. The main reason to that is the different art style and the fact that isn't cute waifus in this series make a lot of people mad.
One user emphasizes just how impactful the gay association has been for them.
Before I started watching it, I was told by God knows how many people that JoJo was gay. After a few months when I started JoJo myself and completed 4 parts, I realised that it was not anything even close. It is a great series with great fights, great power systems, great characters, and great soundtracks. I have myself seen many people who won't watch JoJo just because it is considered gay. This misconception has turned really big.
And perhaps one of my favourite explanations.
Some people are just ignorant. Nothing about JoJo is gay from what I've seen so far. There's just a lot of emphasis on the anatomy and structure of the male characters. It's no different from how Greek sculptors used to craft male figures.
Thank God JoJo is just as straight as all those Greek sculptors. This is pretty much the extent of discourse in this thread. It doesn't feature much disagreement, mainly just some people saying they're annoyed that JoJo is seen as gay and most people agreeing with it. There is a little bit of why does it matter if it's gay, but there's also a bit of no anime is gay, with one user making their opinion clear, saying,
Ymir isn't lesbian. Griffith slept with that guy for the money, not for the attraction, and JoJo isn't gay.
This is a bit closer to the attitude of some of the forum posts from later on, but we'll get to those. Another thread is in response to a question on Quora asking, is JoJo's Bizarre Adventure gay or not? The top answer on this thread is pretty basic, answering yes and showing a bunch of pretty skin-deep gay moments in JoJo. Of course, without missing out on the Joseph and Avdol humping, ending with him commenting,
Jesus Christ, if Hirohiko Araki didn't have a wife, I would think he's the gayest writer alive.
Kind of weird, but alright. It gets more interesting with some of the other responses to the question, however.
No lol. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure isn't a gay show. Just because characters pose with clothings and start off with sus moments, like the part with Joseph and Avdol for example, doesn't mean that it's a gay show. The only reason why that happened was because of the magnet stand user, which is the reason why they were stuck together and they were trying to get out of it. And if you look at the family tree, they were never married by gay people, therefore it's not a gay show.
Another user in the same thread actually uses the same family tree picture, commenting on it.
So no, it's not a gay show. It may be sus, but they have never been married into gay people.
This shows a common interest in the relationships present in the show and the lack of married gay relationships as proof there's no gayness present. While none of the JoJo parts are set in a country where gay marriage was legal at the time it takes place, applying real-world laws to JoJo may seem a bit too pedantic. So let's look at some other responses. A different approach is taken by a user answering,
being bi myself, I can say that all the characters are very attractive, but at the same time, it is an amazing show / manga and most of the guys in the show are straight. There are a few girls in there too, just as stylish as the guys. People thinking that it is gay is most likely due to the author's love for fashion and the lack of extreme female ecchi like most anime has. Basically, you can't call a show gay unless it is a yaoi.
This has a similar tone to the previous answers, with a focus on the lack of gay relationships, with some going as specific as mentioning yaoi being the standard for a gay show, being the anime genre for male-male romances. There is also the mention of a lack of overt female sexualization being a reason why people think JoJo is gay. I don't have much to say on this in the grand scheme, but it's interesting that people see female objectification as so synonymous with shonen and seinen that its absence could possibly imply homoeroticism. Another user's answer goes along with the lack of focus on sexuality, but also adds a new element, saying,
"It has a lot of characters implied to be LGBTQ+, some are confirmed, but the anime itself is not gay because their sexuality isn't the main focus. JoJo has a lot of things associated with gay men, like males taking more submissive roles, wearing feminine clothes, and makeup, but breaking gender roles has nothing to do with one's sexuality."
This point brings up something that you might have already considered. Just because something is associated with gay men, for example, breaking gender roles, this does not mean that the subject itself has to be gay. I'll go more in depth on this point in a later section, but out of all the rebuttals so far, it definitely stands the most ground. One user claims in their summary,
"No, it's not gay, it's an amazing show that's targeted for everyone to enjoy."
This implication that if a show is gay it cannot be enjoyed by non-gay people is usually not said this explicitly, but it seems to be a shared opinion by a lot of people who do not agree with a queer reading of JoJo. Finally, one of my favourite answers.
"No, it's very sus, but not gay. It has gay characters and straight dudes doing gay poses, and in part 5 wearing gay clothes, or in Fugo's case, he dresses like that homeless dude Jaden Smith wishes to be. But then Jaden is gay, so take that as you will. I still watch it, but if it gets too sus, then I'ma stop. Like Steven Universe, love everything about it, but if it gets too much, I don't watch."
Before starting work on this, I didn't realise to the extent which people used sus as a synonym for just a bit gay, but here I am, and honestly it's enlightening. While I think the different answers to the same question in Quora are pretty interesting, it doesn't have the same kind of interactive aggression some other posts can have. So naturally, this means moving on to Reddit. And of course, nowhere other than r/anime. The original post is titled, "Started watching JoJo, it's all kind of undiluted gay," which of course didn't go unchallenged. And it's interesting to note that this post is made after OP had only watched part 1, seen by many as the straight part.
No hate or anything, I'm actually gay, but damn, that caught me off guard. Insanely buff men with feminine faces, striking feminine poses while chatting about love and honour, all within the backdrop of thick melodrama. I'm kinda disappointed it's not BL, honestly.
But this is a relatively innocent claim, especially when considering it's just part 1. However, of course a statement like this sparked debate, with the top reply reading,
"It's called gar, mate. The overglorification of manliness and camaraderie amongst males. Meaning, the same thing Naruto, One Piece and Fairy Tail do with Nakama power, but with manly men doing manly things, while girls are not even relevant. And no, it's not gay."
Gar is mentioned a few times as an explanation of JoJo's debated homoeroticism, and it seems to have a level of traction with some anime circles. It's explained pretty well by this user, but while Gar can be used as a genre, it also seems to be more of a term of affection men have for manly anime characters. This is a reference to the original use of the phrase, where someone mistyped gay, saying "I am Gar" for Archer, in reference to the Fate Stay Night character. OP actually picks up on this similarity in the response, saying,
"Do you understand how gay this sounds?"
This then leads into bickering over semantics, which gets less and less entertaining. The original post does get some more replies, however, with a notable inclusion being,
"Don't confuse bromance for romance."
The use of phrases like gar and bromance, both being terms used essentially as stand-ins for no homo, seems to further reinforce a subconscious understanding that something about JoJo is inherently queer. One user had a bit more of a confusing response, saying,
"The show is not gay. I don't think you understand what gay means. Gay is when one male is sexually attracted to another male. Gay is not when someone thinks something sounds gay."
OP understandably responds with frustration at someone explaining to them, a gay person, what gay means. This then leads to them replying that they're actually gay too, which OP then responds to his old post from the user where he defends sexual attraction to his sister. So, what's the truth? Before moving on, it is worth noting that after the discussion died down, the OP returned to the thread to apologise and say they changed their mind after watching more of the show. This isn't particularly relevant as it doesn't change the responses they got, but it would feel like overlooking something if I excluded it. Finally, and perhaps the messiest thread, is a return to my anime list with a post titled, "Is JoJo popular because it's queer?" Which is an interesting question, but the way the OP continues to elaborate on the question is not anything I would have expected.
"Men wearing lipstick, flamboyant poses galore, butch women. Is it just me, or is JoJo one hell of a queer series? Personally, I couldn't even get through season 1. It was too, for lack of a better term. This really is the best way to describe it. Is that why people fangasm over Jojo? Queerness. A buddy of mine is really into Jojo. He loves Gar. Badass stuff. Can't say I blame him. And I showed him some of the Stardust Crusaders. It was definitely more badass than Season 1. But then it goes down the shitter again in Season 4 with flamboyant high school BS, and only continues to get consistently more queer looking. Fittingly, I hear Stardust Crusaders is one of the worst parts of JoJo, perhaps maybe subconsciously because it's the least gay part. So, is the whole fanbase just in it for the gay then?
After the typical responses of "it's not gay actually" and "why does it matter if it's gay," OP takes it upon themselves to answer some of the more specific issues people had with their post, giving us an insight into their perspective. Some highlights include:
JoJo massively turns me off with its queer art style. Masculine men are good if they're more like Guts from Berserk. When they're flamboyant like in JoJo, it makes me really want to bash my head against a wall. To look queer/gay isn't necessarily sexual. Another way to put it is that the characters in JoJo are defying traditional gender norms. Men wearing flashy, brightly coloured outfits with cut-out hearts, men coloured with lipsticks on the cover art, women being butch as mentioned in my first post. It's not that it's sexually gay that turns me away, it's the queer aesthetic which I'm not a fan of.
Finally, someone gets what I mean about the queer aesthetic. He continues with another highlight being:
unless the artwork is very misleading, it seems very queer. Which is why it seems, if you go on JoJo hashtags on Twitter, it's mostly people with the pronouns in their bio who are gushing over it.
Damn pronouned JoJo fans. One of the pronounless OP's final comments is their personal character assassination of Josuke, saying,
all I know is that Josuke doesn't meet my standard for a cool character based on his design. But I guess I'm more of an edgelord who appreciates traditional masculine dudes in my stories, and not a dude with a pompadour and an extremely effeminate, gay hand-on-hip pose that seems like it's pretty signature for him.
It's almost sad to report that before this thread could become a true masterpiece, the My Anime List admins found it only 5 hours after it began, and it was locked because it violated Rule 5 of the discussion board.
Please refrain from creating threads which extend beyond the discussion of anime/manga as an entertainment medium to highly debated and/or sensitive issues liable to insight rule violations.
My Anime List, this censorship will not be taken lightly. However, this has all given you an insight into how easily fans who think JoJo is queer, whether they like it or not, and fans who adamantly deny this will always manage to find each other and make their disagreements obvious. While some of the denial of JoJo's potential queerness here have been undeniably entertaining, I do not think I've given this perspective a fair enough shot at making their counterpoints. So, let's have a more in-depth look at some of the more based and less sus arguments against JoJo's gayness. When it comes to more well thought out counterpoints against JoJo's potential queerness, something which comes up pretty often is a discussion about toxic masculinity. This was referenced in one of the debates from the previous section, and while people tend to have different approaches with it, it usually boils down to something along the lines of, the men in JoJo are not gay, they're just going against toxic masculinity. If you disagree with this, you're part of the problem. While this is not exactly what everyone who agrees with this says, it's usually something similar to this. While I've seen this viewpoint discussed a few times, it was actually a video titled "JoJo Isn't Gay and Maybe That's a Good Thing" by YouTuber Dealing with Nihilism, which made it stand out. To give a quick summary of the short video, Dealing with Nihilism starts by saying that people think JoJo is gay because of the connections to high fashion and modelling, but they prefer to see it as a masculine-feminine juxtaposition, which they unfortunately do not elaborate on. They continue to question if any JoJo characters are actually gay, and they say they'll go through the 5 animated parts, clearly stating that if something did not happen on screen, it did not happen, and that they want to avoid speculation. Through doing this, they give us a good insight into an anti-subtext viewing of JoJo, specifically focused on queerness. They continue to go through each part and end up labeling Jonathan, Joseph, and Jotaro as straight for having shown attraction to a woman at least once, and then Josuke and Giorno as undecided for not having any explicit attraction within their series. This section is actually done pretty quickly, and I wish they would have gone more in detail on their analysis. But they then move on to the main focus of their video. After listing the first 5 JoJos, they go on to say that they like that none of them are gay. They give a quick aside saying that they would like it if Josuke or Giorno were to be revealed as gay in the future, but only
if it doesn't make sense in the story. I don't want it to be forced.
Not to be a broken record, but more on this line of thinking in the next section. They continue to say that they like none of the JoJos being explicitly gay because it means they are going against toxic masculinity and showing that straight men can go against toxic masculinity while being role models to the young straight men who watch the show. They do acknowledge that queer culture has been instrumental for trailblazing against toxic masculinity, but they stand by their point. They reinforce that a queer JoJo would be a good thing, but it would be best if they were more traditionally masculine so they could exemplify that queer men can be less flamboyant, using Giorno as an example due to his stoicism. It's not as related to their overall point, but it is related to one of my later points, so I think I should quickly include it here, but they do say that Araki should introduce a queer protagonist to offset his questionable canon queer representation, almost exclusively being antagonists up to this point. Jojo is consistently praised for being a symbol against toxic masculinity from both sides of the debate. Another example being in Tachi's essay from earlier, where they say,
JJBA's male characters are not afraid of showing vulnerability. They cry, they express their feelings, and confess their fears, even the most stoic. While this is not unheard of in Japanese media, it's definitely a huge difference from most Western heroes, who are often still bound by the chains of toxic masculinity. And even in the context of Japanese media, JJBA, once again, brings it up to the next level.
And I do agree, Jojo does go against toxic masculinity, but where I take issue to dealing with nihilism's video is a focus on straightness and the straight audience. While the labeling of the first 3 Jojos as straight for their attraction to women is one thing, keeping the ongoing plague of bisexual erasure in mind, what bothers me more is their focus on role models for the straight audience. I do understand why you would focus on the straight audience since of course it's probably bigger, but telling a queer audience that their potential role model should be seen as straight to aid an audience which already gets so much representation in every genre, especially shonen, feels wrong. Especially considering when queer people get so little representation in anime outside of genres like yaoi and yuri, which most of the time are not even made with them in mind. While I can understand the appeal of having JoJo characters being progressive but straight icons, why should queer audiences have to silence their interpretation to make the straight audience feel better about their self-inflicted oppression? The self-inflicted oppression being that toxic masculinity is something exacerbated by straight culture, so why should queer culture be responsible for fixing it? Dealing with nihilism does make some good points in their video, and their conclusion especially does make some good suggestions, but overall the meat of their video should have been a bit more extended so they could fully explain some of their more controversial points in greater detail. Their points also remind me of another phenomena related to this toxic masculinity approach. There are quite a few complaints that people are misreading close male friendships in their show as homo-romantic, and this is damaging to straight men who feel like they do not see good representation of close male friendships. We do see some men unable to have a close bond and express affection towards each other for fear of being seen as gay, and this concern is shared for fictional characters too. This can be seen in JoJo especially with pairings like Joseph and Caesar or Josuke and Okuyasu. It's like the point earlier where that Redditor said, don't mistake bromance for romance. While this is one critique many people have for queer shipping culture, not letting friendships stay friendships, it is by no means unique to this. Of course with fictional characters, everyone can interpret their actions how they want, but some actors who have played them in other media have shown distaste for this phenomena. One of my favourite examples of this, which I think applies to JoJo as well, is a quote by Anthony Mackie. During his time playing the Falcon in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, an interviewer asked Mackie about any potential attraction between the 2 male leads, and Mackie said,
"So many things are twisted and convoluted. There's so many things that people latch onto with their own devices to make themselves relevant and rational. The idea of 2 guys being friends and loving each other in 2021 is a problem because of the exploitation of homosexuality. It used to be that guys could be friends, we can hang out and it was cool. You'd always meet your friends at the bar, you know. You can't do that anymore because something as pure and beautiful as homosexuality has been exploited by people who are trying to rationalise themselves. So, something that's always been very important to me is showing a sensitive masculine figure. There's nothing more masculine than being a superhero and flying around and beating people up. But there's nothing more sensitive than having emotional conversations and a kindred spirit friendship with someone that you care about and love."
While Mackie is trying to make a relatively valid claim about the representation of male friendships in the media, he was mocked online for his rambling and misguided way of conveying this information. There is a good point lost in here somewhere, but saying people who read fictional characters as potentially queer are trying to make themselves relevant and rational, that men can't hang out in a bar together anymore because of the exploitation of homosexuality, and elaborating that homosexuality has been exploited by people who are trying to rationalize themselves, when those people are likely homosexual themselves, you can understand why people took issue with what he was saying. Mackie's goal to want to portray sensitive male characters as an actor is admirable, but his frustration with people thinking one of his characters could be gay makes him come off as maybe too sensitive himself. This sensitivity at being associated with queerness is shared by the JoJo fans who do not like the fact that the characters they relate to and their friendships could be interpreted as queer by queer people, having a completely unique viewing experience. And while straight men can see their straight friendships in characters who are not real, what is so different about queer people recognizing their queer relationships with their wholly different perspective? And what is so scary about seeing a reflection of yourself in a character who is potentially queer if you're so confident in your identity anyway? This sensitivity towards queer readings has been shown to have a negative impact and inevitably further reinforces marginalization. This may sound like a stretch, but we can see it in the disagreements in the previous section, and we can see it through studies and papers which have been published on this very topic. There are quite a few articles published on the repercussions which have been faced by overlooking queer subtext. Kanda's thesis on queer children's literature quotes Amy Vetter, a scholar in English education, saying,
"As a culture, are we insinuating, intentionally or not, that LGBT identities don't matter? That LGBT perspectives and works of literature do not matter? This may be the case as social, educational and political spheres surrounding youth in literature, from the authors to the publishers to the bookstores, schools, libraries and leaders, seem eager to ignore homosexuality."
This is, however, a bit too specific on literary representation. Amanda Justice's article on the relationship between queer subtext and queer baiting gets a little closer, saying,
"But neglecting to take care of how characters interact with each other, with consideration to queer subtexts, is not harmless. It tells LGBTQI+ people that their existence is not worth noting, and their ships are illegitimate and merely the stuff of horny fantasies."
This dismissal of subtext as delusional fantasy is familiar to the situations we have been discussing, but I think the author who gets the most in-depth on the point I'm trying to make is Doty, whose book Making Things Perfectly Queer was quoted briefly earlier. In this, Doty comments on the frustration felt by queer people who feel ashamed to share their own opinion for fear of alienation, saying,
"How often, even if we are openly lesbian, gay or bisexual, have we kept silent or edited our conversations, deciding that our queer opinions are really only interesting to other queers, or that these opinions would make people uncomfortable? Even if we think family, friends and strangers should, of course, feel free to articulate various heterosexual or straight opinions in detail at any time."
This articulation of heterosexual opinions going unchallenged mirrors the expected default straightness we see in some circles of JoJo fans. Doty also says,
"We have paid less attention to the proposition that basically heterocentrist texts can contain queer elements, and basically heterosexual straight identifying people can experience queer moments. And these people should be encouraged to examine and express these moments as queer, not as moments of homosexual panic, or temporary confusion, or as unfortunate, shameful, or sinful lapses in judgment, or taste to be ignored, repressed, or condemned."
This straight identification of perhaps queer elements in the media they're consuming matches the frustration Maki has in his characters being interpreted as queer, or JoJo fans having characters they like being seen as gay by some audiences. Doty then finishes giving advice to those who have queer readings of media.
"If mass culture remains by, for, and about straight culture, it will be so through our silences, or by our continued acquiescence to such cultural paradigms as connotation, subcultures, subcultural studies, subtexting, the closet, and other heterocentrist ploys positioning straightness as the norm."
So yes, JoJo can be against toxic masculinity, and it can help straight JoJo fans not display toxic masculinity themselves. But to be truly against toxic masculinity, you should also be capable of having characters as your role models who could be interpreted as gay and not have that ruin your fun. It was alluded to in the previous section, but in many critiques of queer subtext in general, or even overt queer representation, there is an omnipresent complaint there should only be queer representation if it makes sense. If not, the representation is forced. I mentioned it in the introduction, but the straight until proven guilty mindset is especially prevalent in many shonen fandoms, JoJo being no exception, and when I mean proven, I mean explicit confirmation, or Squalo and Tiziano's on-screen fondling. Doty's quotes in the previous section showed how straight subtext never has to be subtext because it's so ingrained in the cultural way of thinking. Certain tropes in media can be seen as romantic when between a man and a woman, but if the genders are switched at all, it can easily be written off as friendship, and those who say otherwise are stretching. Justice's article speaks on this as well, saying,
"But when these exchanges occur between characters of the same gender, it's like writers and a lot of viewers forget that these tropes are often utilised in romantic pairings. The fact that they are being used in same gender pairings seems to void the romance element to many. Characters are assumed to be straight, even when they are heavily coded to be queer, unless explicitly stated otherwise."
And many people think it is simple to offset this reading by saying something along the lines of, "but there are more straight people," and while statistically true, why should that matter? Telling people that their perspective is invalid because they are part of a smaller group is a much more explicit example of marginalization than you probably would think. And as previously mentioned, Araki has created a world with JoJo where there is no explicit homophobia, a refreshing change, and rarer still, there is very little activity which is even adjacent to it. Doty also speaks on this subduing of queer readings, saying,
"Because of all of this, we queers have become locked into ways of seeing ourselves in relation to mass culture that perpetuate our status as subcultural, parasitic, self-oppressive hangers-on, alienated, yet grabbing for crumbs or crusts and wishfully making this into a whole meal. Our readings and uses of mass culture must always be supplemental or alternative to those of straight culture."
This feeling of queer readings and subtext being supplemental or alternative is why so many people who have these feelings get frustrated when there is an overwhelming rhetoric of your representation has to make sense, otherwise it's forced. You can find this in even the most unsuspecting discussions. In response to a tweet which highlights one of Araki's most explicit pro-gay quotes, where he writes about being able to have a world full of exclusively men loving each other with the right world building, one Twitter user responds,
"Look at where he says, as long as it fits with your manga's world. That's where you draw the line between queer subtext and blatant forcing of so. I don't have a problem with homosexuality in JoJo. I enjoy anything they put out. Just don't force it too much down my throat, fans."
So we can see that even when a mangaka publicly supports queerness and the user accepts that queerness is in JoJo's universe, it can still be seen as forced. I think the reason why so many people see queer interpretation of JoJo as forced is because of the genre being shonen. When it comes to queerness, there are certain people who will primarily associate this as male homosexuality, which is seen in the JoJo fandom, which is excessively hypersexualized. This overt focus on the sexual side of these relationships over the romantic leads people to think that queerness is too explicit and adult to include in shonen, which is primarily aimed at a teen audience. This is further reinforced by the main queer representation in anime being in genres like yaoi and yuri, which can be good, but the majority of the time are fetishistic and not actually aimed at the audiences they try to represent. This is evidenced in Nicholas Bennett's essay on queer representation in anime, saying,
"Most of those depictions of queer romance were only in sexualized, pornographic-esque publications known as yuri and yaoi."
They link this to why queerness is less represented in more mainstream anime series.
The biggest contributing factor is censorship by Japanese studios and American networks. Censorship in this case can be cutting funding for an anime after backlash, English dubbing that fails to translate same-gender attraction, editing animation styles to hide visuals of queer romance, and more. Neither Japan or the United States have official codes against representation of same-gender romance in anime, but the actions of studios and networks reflect a generalization of profanity, as seen with the Sailor Moon and Neon Genesis Evangelion.
By looking at this, we can see why an author of mainstream shonen manga like Araki may have been hesitant to be explicit with any queer representation, especially given the era he was writing the manga parts which have currently been animated, being the late 80s to the early 2000s. With the genre being shonen, the expectation for straight to be default is as prevalent as ever. If you have even watched a handful of shonen anime or read shonen manga, you have probably noticed typical underdeveloped straight romance plotlines with no chemistry wheedling their way into the text. This is especially frustrating when these romances seem to manifest from nowhere at the end of the show's run just to get a mediocre reception from the fanbase. With romances like these, you can understand why some audiences prefer to take a subtextual approach to romance, instead of accepting the occasionally bland canon offerings. Not to say that all romance in shonen is bad, but I'm hesitant to say it is better more often than it isn't. This expectation, as straight as default, may seem natural to a lot of people, especially if you're taking a more utilitarian approach to representation. But mindsets like this are what contribute to issues like bisexual erasure, which we can see being incredibly noticeable when talking about the first 3 JoJos. Not to keep coming back to dealing with nihilism's video, but their quick summary of the JoJo's sexualities is a perfect example of this mindset in action. To summarize, they say Jonathan is only shown to be attracted to Irina, so he is straight. Joseph, while having a potentially queer-coded relationship with Caesar, ends up with Suzy-Q, so is straight. And while Jotaro shows no romantic or sexual attraction throughout either part 3 or 4, because he had an off-screen relationship with a woman before part 6, he's straight. As I've repeated, to many people this seems natural, but to audiences who are likely not straight, this comes off as dismissing any chance for these characters to have a sexuality between fully heterosexual or homosexual. This is not me saying these 3 characters are bisexual, but the attitude of a man being shown as attracted to a woman automatically making them straight, and vice versa, is incredibly damaging to the state of bisexual representation. I'm not going to harp on bisexual erasure too much since it's a more complex issue than I can address in an essay about JoJo, but overlooking it would be incredibly ironic. Not to ignore By Jonathan supporters, but overlooking the potential bisexuality of characters like Joseph and Jotaro feels especially dismissive. Actually, not to keep narrowing it down, but especially Joseph. I'm not going to go on a Caesar and Joseph tangent, but rewatch part 2 with their relationship in mind and you might notice something. The idea of queer representation being forced is a strange one, because I don't think it's easy to convince people to change this attitude, largely because I don't think it's ever been thought through with much depth, and often, I don't want to assume, is usually a cover-up for not wanting to see it. This is not to make a sweeping statement. For example, I don't think Dealing with Nihilism made any of their implications intentionally. Just looking at the rest of their channel, you can see they have a focus on the state of queer representation in general. However, when it comes to queer representation and its relationship with queer subtext, defining good representation will always depend on who you are asking. Heading all the way back to the anonymous student's essay, their statement on the style of queer representation in anime heavily relates to this.
Nowadays, especially in the West, in order for media to offer good queer representation, the 2 characters must be involved in a defined romantic or sexual relationship. Sometimes, even saying, "I love you" is not enough for a relationship to be defined as queer. This restrictive definition of queer representation can be a very straight concept, as a large part of the queer experience is found in not fitting into labels and categories. Additionally, when talking about anime, it is important to keep in mind that its intended audience is generally not people from the West. Given Japan's relatively conservative culture, queer-coded subtext is valuable because it serves as an outlet for queer people to express themselves without being outed.
So, when considering the defaults we are working with, it is worth considering what media we are projecting our expectations onto, and the context behind it. But when it comes to considering context, surely there is nothing more relevant than talking about our author. It's cropped up a significant number of times throughout the video, but what about Araki? What has he said on all this? Because surely that is what matters the most, and that will be our deciding factor. When it comes to specific statements, Araki has never said anything along the lines of "don't make my characters gay, they're not gay," but he's also not said the opposite either. A lot of JoJo fans think that Araki is not going to be capable of writing about queerness because he has a wife and has been happily married for years now. I don't particularly see the logic in this, but it is what some people believe. On this topic, there are a few people who seem to have weird opinions about Araki's sexuality, with a few people from earlier thinking he was gay after reading JoJo. This is seen in the Quora answer from earlier, and a review of JoJo by a blogger called Nickname Nick strangely starts with,
"Much to my admitted shame, I assumed that Hirohiko Araki was a gay man, when he is, in fact, not, and based that on his work, more than anything more empirical like statements from interviews."
I'm not in the business of theorizing the sexuality of real people, but I would say this is a strange testament to a potential queer subtext in JoJo. I am, however, in the business of analysing his statements to see if he has shown any support for queer readings. To start with, there seems to be a certain section of the fanbase who aim to paint Araki as homophobic, to perhaps debunk any chance of JoJo being queer. The best clear example of this I could find was on a Reddit post titled, "I just learned Hirohiko Araki is a homophobe, and I wish to put a bullet through his brain," which shows an interview where Araki says gay people should disappear. However, it quickly transpired that Araki's words had been fabricated using fake subtitles, with Looper's Phil Archbold writing an article about Araki, part of which addresses this.
It didn't take long for those who knew Araki's work to point out that these were clearly fake subtitles created by a troll to get a reaction. Unfortunately, not everybody realised that. Araki addressed the fake interview during a chat with Viz Media, confirming that he remains a huge supporter of the LGBT community. "I created many androgynous characters to express what I think," he said. "Scarlet from Part 7 and Dio are both bisexual. There's a rumour that I'm homophobic because of a fake interview, but now I'm going to prove that rumour wrong." Araki proceeded to list a number of ways in which his characters break gender norms before revealing that the vicious rumours about him being homophobic hurt him deeply. "The fact that thousands of people thought that the fake interview was real makes me lose hope in humanity."
This would be Araki's most explicit endorsement of the queer community, if I could find it anywhere other than here. Sometime between Looper posting this article in April 2020 and now in late 2022, Their link to this interview with Viz Media is nearly impossible to find, with Looper's link saying the video has been taken down. I scoured every posted interview between Araki and Viz Media since 2020 and searched for this quote, only to find no actual sources. So not to critique the journalistic integrity of Looper, but without any other sources it feels wrong to cite this quote without hesitation. So, what other evidence do we have of Araki's allegiances? An argument which commonly comes up when it comes to talking about Araki's support for queerness is Anasui. Jonin's love interest in Part 6 was apparently originally intended to be female, and when they first appear early on in Part 6 they appear to look female, but when they are introduced later on they are redesigned to appear male, and this is how Anasui is treated for the rest of the series. For a long time this was treated as showing Araki's intention for a lesbian relationship getting suppressed by editors at Shonen Jump, but after some digging and watching Harmon Beat's video on the subject, the sources for this story do not really exist. However, Harmon Beat's video does confirm alternative readings of Anasui, with Araki stating that Anasui was intended to be androgynous, and when approached by David Production upon Part 6 getting animated, he was asked what he would like them to do about Anasui's gender, and apparently he gave them free rein for how they want to adapt the character. If you want a more in-depth look at this topic, I recommend watching Harmon Beat's video, but what I can glean from it here is, while it doesn't seem like there was much intention for Anasui and Jolene to be in a lesbian relationship, it does seem like Anasui is intended to be a very genderqueer character. Further evidence can come from a quote from Araki's book on the theory of writing manga, which is briefly mentioned earlier, where he states,
I think that even if you're creating a manga that includes love and romance, you could have it between two male characters, as long as that fits with your manga's world. As long as your characters are appealing, you could get away with a world of all men. You have nothing to fear.
This, I think, is Araki's most obvious endorsement of the queer community, even if it does not explicitly relate to his work. Some people do still think he should do more to openly support the community. Returning to Jenikov's article, they point out,
interviewers even tell Araki of their fan theories of who was in love with whom, and Araki demurs every time as if he's unable to see the queer aesthetic universe he's accidentally created.
I cannot know for sure, but I can assume that Jenikov is referring to Araki's 2007 magazine interview with Eureka, which funnily enough is actually where Araki confirms Dio's bisexuality. Looking through the interview archive, it seems less like an interview and more like the interviewer, referred to as Kaneda, telling Araki about his interpretations and looking for explicit confirmation. The clearest example of this being,
fundamentally, Dio is a character who started out in poverty. So then, because of his desire to be successful in life, he's not afraid of anyone, and he's not afraid to dirty himself to make his way to the top. Girls love that sort of thing. Fujoshi-wise, I mean in my mind, at the point in Part 6 where the character of Father Pucci that feels seriously about Dio, I've made this theory of Dio equals princess. Like he started out from the status of prostitute, so he dirtied his body with lots of different men, but his soul never lost its purity, and the 16-year-old Pucci was attracted by that. Early on, there's a scene where Dio and Pucci are sitting slovenly on the same bed facing different directions and having a discussion. I simultaneously could barely believe my eyes and went mad with joy. That's the effect you must have been going for, right, Araki-sensei?
Faced with all that, no wonder Araki demurred. In spite of all this, through these findings I can surmise that Araki is down with the queers, and seems relatively indifferent to how people interact with his media, but honestly, who cares? On the 19th of October 2019, the 45th chapter of Tsugumi Ohba's Platinum End was published by Jump Square. When it comes to discussing the worst chapters in the series, this one comes up in conversation for just one reason. About halfway through the chapter, after being told that she sounds homophobic for saying this guy-on-guy stuff is kinda hard to take, the character called Tamari replies, saying, "Look, personal preferences and tastes are not discrimination. My only romantic interest is in men, that's all. If you ask me, the next god should do something about all this hysteria about claiming harassment and discrimination. Discrimination is a social system backed by the powerful, like slavery or anti-Semitic persecution and apartheid or whatever. That's how it starts when someone in power says, I don't like these people, so let's all make life miserable for them. When Wretched Holoman said, if I am God, I'll kill all the uglies. That's discrimination. Are you gonna say that swiping right on a dating app is the same thing? At this point, it would be an act of discrimination to refuse a marriage proposal. I said it was hard to take, not creepy. Legalize gay marriage before you start coming for me." And then the smart glasses dude replies to her, "She's got a point." Understandably, many fans of the series took issue with this rant, with one user articulating frustrations on Reddit saying,
I will never get over Tamari saying that same-sex relationships were hard to take and then immediately backpedaling on it and saying it was okay because she didn't say that they were creepy, and that totally makes it an okay thing to say. I spent a solid 10 minutes as a gay man just sitting there wondering what the fuck the difference between the two sentiments was supposed to be. It felt so weirdly out of place and invalidating for her to randomly go on this rant about cancel culture as if gay people like me shouldn't be insulted by statements like that. Not only that, but at this moment, I realised that the characters were no longer characters. They were vessels for his own thoughts and ideology. A random lecture about cancel culture is the most bizarre thing to suddenly just happen here, and only somewhat fits because Temari is meant to be a vapid social media mogul, obsessed with money because she used to be poor. That would be fine. But then the other characters in the room started going, "Ooh, she has a point," as if she had just said something generally profound other than, "I'm not homophobic," and you thinking there's something wrong with what I said is what's actually wrong.
The Reddit user hits the nail on the head here. This passage from Temari here is a poorly disguised substitute for Ohba's own self-righteous homophobia, and by having another character call her smart for saying it, he's essentially patting himself on the back. So, what's this got to do with Jojo and Araki? Well, if you're not familiar with any of Tsugumi Ohba's other work, he is also responsible for another manga series with an anime adaptation called Death Note. And if you have any level of familiarity with Death Note, you probably know how rife the relationship between our anti-hero Light and his rival L is with homoerotic subtext. This is not my original take. Ask even the biggest skeptic of queer subtext about L and Light, and even they will acknowledge that there is at least a gay undertone. But from Ohba's thinly veiled stance in Platinum End, does this seem like the type of author who would willingly create almost universally recognised queer subtext? No, it doesn't. What I'm trying to say here, as interesting it can be to study the authors of the media we consume, it only matters so much to how we enjoy the media. The context of an author's true feelings are not always as obvious as Ohba's, and are almost certainly not included outright in the media itself. So why do we let it impact our enjoyment so heavily? Just because an author created a universe does not mean that we can let their every whim and opinion dictate how we enjoy their content. I'm not saying that Araki is saying that wizards are actually shitting themselves and magicking away the evidence J.K. Rowling style, but I am saying we should not be dictating the way people enjoy JoJo because that's not what Araki intended, especially if we don't even know that for sure. This mindset of not caring about what the author says about their content is called death of the author, since we are treating them as dead. And while I'm not suggesting the fandom metaphorically kills Araki, I also don't think we should be hanging on to every interview for instructions on how to enjoy his media, because honestly, are you even enjoying yourself at that point? Even if Araki had no intention and was completely unaware and ignorant to potential queer influences when writing any part of JoJo, we can still not explain why this series resonates with so many queer people. Returning to Tachi's essay, they specifically reference this, saying,
JoJo's Bizarre Adventure definitely shakes things up. I don't know if it was done purposely by Araki, if he woke up one morning and thought, I'm going to destroy gender binarism with this work, or if he just wanted to draw pretty men in pretty clothes, and didn't really care about queer liberation. His attention ultimately is irrelevant to me. What matters is that thanks to him, I found a piece of my identity reflected in popular media.
This indifference to Araki's intention in favour of personal experiences is a perfect example of the death of the author mindset. Tachi continues to explain why they think JoJo is such good representation, no matter what the intention, saying,
I think JoJo's Bizarre Adventure and its successes, especially in the queer community, can teach Western storytellers a lot in terms of representation. Merely stating a character's marginalisation is not enough, at least not without commitment to representing what that marginalisation truly means at its core. Representation needs to be nuanced to embrace the kaleidoscope of experiences within a marginalised community. Finally, it needs to be something made for marginalised people, with the primary aid not to educate the majority, but to, represent us with enthusiasm, empowerment, and joy.
What Tachi is saying is that something can resonate with a queer community not by educating those who are not them and focusing on their struggles, but instead making something which they can actually enjoy. Sorda also concludes their analysis on JoJo by exemplifying more of this positive representation which Tachi is alluding to.
As long as Araki doesn't make any big announcements, we'll never really know if these characters are LGBT. But what matters in the end is positive representation, and even though Joseph and Giano and all the others aren't explicitly gay, queer fans can see themselves in these heroes. Watching fashion-obsessed Josuke or hard-ass butch Jolene punch their opponents into next week is encouraging to viewers who may be ostracised in real life for having those same traits. And that validation is worth far more than whatever Araki says.
We can see here that Death of the Author does not intend to disrespect the author. We aren't dancing on Araki's hypothetical grave, but instead appreciating the media for what it is and how individuals interact with it, instead of an authoritative experience dictated by an author. Kanda even mentions this disconnect in their thesis, stating,
A queer subtext can exist solely for a reader with no intentional work done on the part of the creators. A text may be marked as containing the possibility of a queer subtext through the production of said text, the reception of a text by readers, or through cultural context relevant to contemporary readers.
If my point isn't clear enough by now, while I think Araki's opinions are interesting, I don't think they should dictate our enjoyment of his media. My issue with people referencing authorial intent is that it often only appears when it comes to telling people that they are wrong. We witnessed it a few times when looking at the disagreements between the two sides of the fandom. But what I don't think people who use this scapegoat understand, apart from using sources, is what they are actually using it against. When you find out someone you're acquainted with shares an interest, it's almost natural instinct to ask their opinions on certain elements of the media. While different interpretations of events may lead to debate, it never usually leads to citing the author is on your side and accusations that you're twisting the media into something it never was. Much earlier in this essay, I compared readings of queer subtext, or really just subtext in general, to theory videos, and I think this is the best place to elaborate on that. A subtextual reading is essentially a way of interpreting certain canonical elements of media and using personal intuition and knowledge of the media to come to a conclusion. A theory can be made by picking up on clues left in media and using personal intuition and knowledge of the media to come to a conclusion. Neither are canonical at the time of the conclusion being reached, and both could be confirmed or ignored by the media itself. But when we look in the comment section of a standard theory video, people usually respond by saying something along the lines of, "Wow, that has made me reconsider the media. That's an interesting way to interpret that element of the media," or usually the harshest response would be, "That's a bit of a stretch." In comparison, why is a statement which picks up on queer subtext responded to with such vitriol and insults? It's a hot take so many people don't want to hear, but maybe you aren't as comfortable with queer people as you think you are. While this video may seem like a bloated advocacy piece in favour of subtext, sometimes reading subtextually can backfire. In early June this year, Korean pop group ITZY began teasing their newest EP titled Checkmate, slated for release in July, and it seemed like it was everything fans had been waiting for. Since the group's debut 3 years earlier, most releases they had made were aimed at a teen audience with a focus on being different and not fitting in, and they became popular for their teen crush sound. But after the sound had defined their music for 3 years, fans wanted something different, and the refined royal aesthetic of the early Checkmate teasers looked promising. However, this all changed in late June when a new set of teasers released, with a Checkmate concept spray painted over and the new Sneakers teaser was put over it, and with it came a snippet of the song where the group messed around in a park with the lyrics being about putting sneakers on. This abrupt change led most of the fandom to mourn the original concept and many to start thinking this was fake. The album is called Checkmate, maybe the group is playing chess with us. Maybe they're tricking us into thinking this song is the title track, but it's actually fake. This song can't be real, can it? This continued with a speculation and analysis of teasers growing wilder, and many fans were waiting for the bait to be switched and for Sneakers to be replaced with the royal concept they had been promised. Every time a new teaser would come out, a Twitter thread would follow about how the concept is fake, and we're being tricked, and many were convinced. But then on the 15th of July, when the album was set to release, reality dawned on the ITZY fandom, and the Sneakers music video was posted, to what I'll forgivingly call a mixed response, featuring standout translated lyrics like, "I'm offbeat and I like that. I dance to my own drum. Call me crazy, call me trouble, or you can call me weirdo. I'ma make this clear though. Put my sneakers on, tie 'em up, ready, get, set, go." Hardly the refined royal elegance fans had expected. I'm not saying reading subtextually will always lead to feeling like an ITZY fan on the 15th of July 2022, in fact, the opposite can be just as true as well. Spoilers for Legend of Korra, but after a season of mostly subtextual teasing, despite the odds, Legend of Korra ends with Korra and Asami in a romantic relationship. Reading subtext can lead to ending up feeling victorious or defeated upon authorial confirmation, but as we have seen with many JoJo fans, they're fine with their subtextual readings. And while I am sure that a lot of the audience would prefer more explicit representation, when you look deeper into Araki's work, you can see why many people struggle to deny JoJo's connection to a queer subtext. You can see this in just how many queer audiences resonate with this media specifically. There is no one piece of gotcha evidence for why JoJo is queer, but if there was, it would be the massive amount of people recognizing queer subtext throughout the series. This is the reason why conversation around JoJo's queerness is so controversial and divisive, because the representation provided to queer audiences by Araki is abstract, but still tactile. It is something easy to debate for the people who do not want to see it. Doty speaks on this, saying,
"The queerness I point out in mass culture representation and reading in this book is only connotative, and therefore deniable or insubstantial as long as we keep thinking within conventional heterocentrist paradigms, which always already have decided that expressions of queerness are subtextual, subcultural, alternative readings, or pathetic and delusional attempts to see something that isn't there." Queer readings aren't alternative readings, wishful or willful misreadings, or reading too much into things readings. They result from the recognition and articulation of a complex range of queerness that has been in popular culture texts and their audiences all along.
I agree with Doty on these points, and while I'm not going to say that denying queer readings of JoJo makes you responsible for queer hate crimes, I do think it can be reflective of personal biases. However, with Subtext, I do think there is a large audience who will never be able to be convinced to read media this way, and after all this, I still think it's understandable. From the start, I've been saying how hard this concept is to explain, and wrapping your head around a certain way to experience media for the sake of having a different reading is not worth it for most people. But at the same time, with all the people who read subtextually, I think it can be ignorant to deny its existence, especially with the history and cultural connotations which surround subtextual readings. While this video was focused on JoJo as a series, I do hope the information on reading subtextually can be applied to other media, and if you're a fan of JoJo who does not know how to articulate their queer reading of the show, I hope this has given you something to work with. I'm looking forward to seeing what Araki gives us with the upcoming 9th part of JoJo. We could get to see our first canonically queer protagonist, or we could get another Jonathan and Arena. Either way, I'm sure JoJo's Bizarre Adventure will be just as queer as it has been since 1987. If you've got this far, thank you so much. I know this is a long video for what could have been like a quick answer. I could have just been like, JoJo's kind of gay, that's the answer. But no, I went a bit extra about it, so thank you for watching. If you like what you see, consider subscribing. I don't always post videos about JoJo, but I do post videos in this style, so if you like long form video essays, I guess, like this, yeah, subscribe. And turn on notifications if you want to know when I post anything new. As I said, I'm super inconsistent, so if you want to know when something new has come out, do that. But yeah, but more importantly, the Helena Taylor Bayonetta 3 news came out just the other day for me, and it's kind of mad because I really thought Bayonetta 3 was going to come out with no controversy. I was so sure. And yeah, no, it's kind of mad. Like, just a month before coming out, this game has now become so controversial. Like, yeah, it's crazy. I don't know, because the first and second games are so controversial, and then this one was just like everyone's so happy about it, everyone's so excited. But yeah, if you want to see a video about the controversy on the first 2 games, shameless plug, but yeah, go watch it. I'm really happy with it still, which is kind of mad. I thought by this point I'd be cringing at it, but even though it's my first video and it's so rough, like, I'm still happy with it. But yeah, no. Also, more importantly, the thank yous, because Annie helped me so much with editing this. This video script has had like 4 drafts, and it's just, which I guess that isn't that much compared to some people's stuff, but yeah, for a script this long, 4 drafts really felt like a lot. But no, it's amazing, and this has become so much more legible, so thank you. And also Jay helped me with editing as well, and he did a good job, but he also helped me a lot with the voice work. He's the one who does all the quotes, and there are so many quotes for this one, so the fact that he was willing to do this, yeah, no, it was great. And yeah, no, I'm really happy with how it's turned out. And of course, Boat Nautical did the thumbnail as always, and it's so good. It's probably my favorite. I always say they're my favorite, but this is definitely my favorite. Like, Josuke is one of my favorite characters, so of course, but just the way they interpreted my prompt is amazing. I love it so much. I love how it's kind of like Araki's art style, but so distinctly theirs. And yeah, no, I'm really happy with how it turned out. So go and follow them on Tumblr and Instagram, because they're amazing and they do loads of other art than my thumbnails, so go and check it out. But yeah, as you can tell, I've kind of been, well, this is the first video I've uploaded in like half a year. The last one, I re-uploaded the One Piece one because I had a bunch of, like, what's the word? Copyright issues. Copyright, yeah. No, Toei don't like people using their stuff in videos, even if it's fair use, but we move. But yeah, no, I've been working on this video for ages. I've been working on it since summer, and it was originally going to just be a cross comparison between just shonen in general and queer subtext they have in them, and I was gonna compare Naruto, Evangelion, and JoJo, of course. And I had some good ideas for it, and I started researching it quite a bit, but then I kind of realized I have no reason to want to compare them. There's not like any interesting conclusion there. They just all have like queer subtext, and they also have people who like don't like talking about the queer subtext there. And I was like, so they all kind of have like parallels, but I was just like, there's no reason to compare them. And God, imagine how long this would be if I did all 3 of them in the same video. But yeah, no, I decided just to do JoJo, and I'm very happy with that decision. I might go back and do something on Naruto, but I don't think I'd do it the same format I did this, because I'd probably want to take a different approach. And I just don't know Evangelion well enough to do it. I know, I need to watch the actual series. I watch the Rebuild movies, but I don't think watching the Rebuild movies is like, I've consumed enough of this franchise to be able to write about it. Like, no, I need to go back and actually watch it. And finally, some stuff I just want to say to cover my ass, because yeah, I just know there's some like open points and in the video, and I just like I need to make sure I've covered all my bases. I need to make sure I've considered everything. So the main one is I need to mention that there's some people who it's just not that deep to. Like, I kind of made it sound like everyone's really angry about it and everyone's picked a side. Like, oh, you're either you hate that JoJo has like queer subtext and you want to deny it because you're like insecure about whatever, or you're a gay person who thinks there's gay subtext, or a straight person who thinks there's gay subtext. But I kind of realized that there's a lot of people who like recognize the gay subtext there, but they like don't get that angry about it and they don't like argue about it. Like, they just like, there's straight people who enjoy it and just like take the piss of the fact that there's like gay subtext. They're not mean about it, but like, you know, they'll like make jokes about it. I saw this video by a guy called Juice Man, and I was just like, right after I finished working on this, and it really annoyed me that I hadn't considered it, because I was just like, oh yeah, some people make jokes about JoJo being gay, and it's just like, it's funny because they're not trying to deny it, it just is, and they can still enjoy it and not be mad about it. So I was just like, oh god, I should really mention that. That's the first thing. Second, this is really minor, but I just thought I should say it. There's a quote by a guy called Ferdinand earlier on in the essay where he mentions that there's no homophobia in the world of JoJo, and he mentions that no one ever comments on any other character's style, because like there are barely any comments about people's style in JoJo. But then I realized that it's like a big not plot device. Is it a plot device? It's a big thing in part 4 that whenever people make fun of Josuke's hair, which happens like semi-regularly, but like every now and then, that like he gets really angry, and that's like a thing. And I was like, oh, people do comment on style in JoJo, but like barely. So it doesn't ruin their point whatsoever, but I was like, I should mention that. And finally, I'm not coming for ITZY. Sneakers is a fine song. I'm more talking about the fact that it wasn't what ITZY fans wanted at all. Or at least a lot of them, the ones I was like seeing on Twitter and stuff, they like was so felt betrayed by JYP putting out that song, doing the concept change and the switch. And I think it's quite funny to talk about. But if you're an ITZY fan who also likes JoJo and queer subtext and you've got this far, I'm sorry, I don't mean to make fun of ITZY that much. I don't think I like sound too harsh, but yeah, no, it's just I felt bad that I was just like coming for ITZY a bit too much maybe. But yeah, no, Sneakers is a funny song, but I'm sure ITZY fans who wanted songs about shoes were really happy. But yeah, no, that's it. That's everything I have to say. So thank you for listening. Thank you for getting this far. If you got this far, very dedicated. Thank you. I'm sure you're the ITZY fan waiting for an apology, so I hope you feel happy that you got it. But yeah, no, stay tuned for my Sasuke and Naruto analysis, which I'm sure I'll do one day. But yeah.